Cybernator busted out of its mech suit and onto your Super NES back in 1992. Developed by NCS Corp and published by Konami, Cybernator seemingly came out of nowhere for us US gamers, but was actually part of the Assault Suit series of games that spanned more than a decade's worth of consoles in Japan. Sadly though, most of those games were rarely localized for the US, and even when they were never directly referenced as a series. In fact, Cybernator is a direct prequel to the only other Assault game that came to the US, that being Target Earth for the Sega Genesis. Still though, the act of getting into a giant mech and blowing shit up is usually universally awesome. So was Cybernator good enough to stand on its own for us folks in the West, even without the Assault Suit lineage in tow? Or was this yet another case of an incomprehensible game series that was best left over in Japan? Well, strap yourself into your favorite 50-foot tall mech, because we're about to see if Cybernator crushes the competition under its massive metal foot. Start up Cybernator and you're treated to what has to be one of the more in-depth storylines for a Super NES game. Throwing things at you like military drama, wars over dwindling fossil fuels, and more than enough political intrigue to fill an episode of House of Cards, Cybernator definitely thinks it has a story to tell. And while it's not anything that's gonna make you want to look up a plot synopsis after you beat it, it's worth mentioning for just how few Super NES games attempted a more adult-oriented plot. This certainly isn't another bright and colorful mascot platformer here, as Cybernator's world is a bleak sci-fi setting, and the plot goes out of its way to tell a more mature story from beginning to end. It's just too bad that it seems to like its storytelling a bit too much, but we'll get into that a little later. Once you make it past all the story scenes and mission briefings, you're literally thrust into what looks like your standard 2D action game. You play as a soldier piloting a giant mech, with your goal being to make it to the end of each stage to fight a boss and move on. If that sounds familiar, then congratulations, you've probably played a video game before. But once you actually start playing, you'll see that Cybernator isn't quite as standard as it may first seem. For one, your mech feels and controls like the giant heavy robot it is. Moving around in Cybernator will definitely take some practice, as your slow, lumbering mech isn't quite the super agile platform character that you might be used to. The result is a slower paced game that requires a bit more strategy than just running headfirst into things, since if you do that, you'll be at the continue screen in short order. Jumping also takes some getting used to, as getting around the large multi-path levels feels about how it should if a 100-ton robot decided to suddenly jump around it. You do at least get a booster to help you get higher than the 7 feet or so that you can jump, so you'll need to get used to using that to get to where you need to go. You also get a super awkward thruster dash that propels your character forward or backward for a second or two, which is usually best used to retreat from battles that aren't going your way or getting past annoying traps. For the most part though, it's fun to pilot your mech around each level, even if it can occasionally be a bit clumsy. You do at least get a decent arsenal to do battle with. At first you start off with a rapid-fire Vulcan cannon that'll probably be your go-to weapon for the majority of the game. You also start off with a punch that's good to use for enemies that like to use shields, but it's generally useless for the rest of the game. Over the course of the game you'll find more weapons to use if you explore, including missiles and a laser cannon later in the game. You can also find weapon power-ups in each stage as well, allowing you to level up each weapon individually to make them more powerful. Unfortunately, they don't drop too often, so you'll need to decide on which weapon you want to keep powering up, leaving other weapons less powerful. And much like controlling your mech, using your weapons will take a bit of practice, since Cybernator allows you to completely control where you want to shoot, independent of moving around. This can feel super clumsy at first, but you eventually get used to aiming around the screen. You can also lock the position of your gun by holding down the L trigger, which is an absolute must if you want to beat most bosses. That's really about all the help the game's going to give you though, and the rest is going to be left up to you to break through the enemy lines. As mentioned before, the levels in Cybernator feature more than a few different paths to make your way to the end. It's not exactly a maze or anything, but you'll usually find multiple ways around each level. If you take the time to fully explore the level, you'll be able to make your own path through the stage that benefits you the most with weapon and health drops that may not be in other areas of the stage. Some stages even feature open exploration, forcing you to find a particular way to the next part of the stage. Combine that with the occasional vertical shooter stage, and some not very fun zero-gravity sections where your mech just kind of bounces all over the screen, and you've got a really good variety of levels. Even the bosses are pretty great, featuring huge sprites that can fill the entire screen, and some that even feature secondary objectives besides just killing them. If there's one area where Cybernator really excels, it's in the stages and the variety they throw at you. Every stage feels unique, and usually has some neat one-off gimmick to throw in. You definitely won't be feeling like you're doing or seeing the same thing over and over in Cybernator. While Cybernator is a pretty great mech game, it does have its fair share of problems. The biggest being the story itself. Well, not so much the actual story, just the way it's presented. As mentioned before, Cybernator's story was a refreshing change of pace from the rest of the Super NES library, but the game goes way overboard with it. Having cutscenes and pre-mission briefings are all fine, but Cybernator seems to want to add a cinematic feel to the game with dialogue that pops up throughout the stage itself. And I'm not talking about a bit of text here and there while you play either. No, we're talking about some pretty long interruptions that actually stop the game dead cold in its tracks to throw out a wall of text at you. And for a game this focused on fast action, having the game randomly pause right in the thick of battle is jarring to say the least. At its worst, it can actually affect gameplay, as you struggle to follow through with what you were trying to do before the game decided to conveniently pause for more needless text. The rest of the time, the seemingly endless dialogue pauses are just incredibly annoying, especially if you could care less about the plot. Sadly, this is something that goes throughout the entire game, and never stops getting in the way of what should otherwise be a great action game. At the end of the day, Cybernator was still an amazing find for any of us that was lucky enough to rent or buy it without knowing anything more about it than just blow stuff up with giant robots. Surprisingly enough though, that's all most of us needed. And thanks to its strangely in-depth for a Super NES game plot, it ended up having a lot of fans that would later go on to seek out the other games in the series. And even if you're not interested in its overly convoluted plot and can look past the constant annoying story interruptions, you'll get a really great action game here, complete with some of the best graphics the Super NES can spit out. Hell, even just getting a good mech game in the US was a treat for those of us that sat patiently through dozens of cartoony mascot platform games for something a bit more adult. So if you ever see Cybernator somewhere for a decent price, definitely pick it up. It's one of, if not the best mech game for the Super NES, and one that'll make you want to suit up for it over and over again.